Welcome back, team. In this screencast, we're going to start Chapter 5, and we're going to cover sections 5.1 and 5.2. Chapter 5 is all about biodiversity, species interactions, and population control. Chapter 5's case study concerns the story of the southern sea otter. The southern sea otter is currently found between Santa Cruz and Santa Barbara here in California, but it used to be found all the way up in Oregon and all the way down in Baja California until the early 1900s when they were hunted nearly to extinction. In 1977, they were added to the endangered species list, and since then, they've made a partial recovery. They're actually on track to being removed from the endangered species list. We should care about the southern sea otter because ethically, we should protect biodiversity. For tourism, people will go to places like Monterey just to see the sea otters in the water. And finally, southern sea otters are keystone species. They're important predators that control the populations of animals like sea urchins that without the sea otter would decimate kelp forests. On the left side, you'll see another picture of the southern sea otter, this time feeding on marine invertebrates. On the right side are kelp forest, which is the natural habitat of the southern sea otter. In section 5.1, we're going to look at how species interact with one another. The way that two different species interact with one another is called symbiosis. Symbiosis means living together. There are 5 basic types of interactions or symbiosis: interspecific competition, predation, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. Interspecific competition is competition between members of two different species. The easy way to remember that is the prefix inter means between. Two different species cannot compete for the same resource in the same way indefinitely. This is known as the competitive exclusion principle. If two different species compete for the same resource in the same way, one of two things can happen. First, one of the species can be driven out. 2, the two species can learn how to share the resource. This is called resource partitioning, and the two species can use the resource in different ways or at different times. This diagram provides an example of resource partitioning. These are species of warblers that live in the same forest in the state of Maine. Each species uses the trees in the forest differently, and as a result, they can coexist with one another. Another example of resource partitioning are the honey creepers that live on the islands of Hawaii. Each honey creeper species has evolved a different type of beak to feed on different fruits, seeds, insects, and nectars. In this way, they can reduce interspecific competition and coexist with one another. A predator is an organism that feeds on all or part of another organism, which we call the prey. A carnivore is an animal that feeds on other animals. Carnivores use many different strategies in order to obtain their prey. The hawk and the great white shark here use pursuit and ambush. They locate, chase after, and capture their prey. Polar bears use camouflage or hiding. With their white color, the polar bears hide against the snow and ice and wait for seals to come up for air or to rest. Tigers also use camouflage. With their stripes, tigers break up their outline so it's harder for their prey to notice them. Cobras and other venomous snakes use Cobras and other venomous snakes use chemical warfare in order to obtain their prey. They will inject their prey with venom, which paralyzes and/or kills them. Prey species are not helpless. They have their own strategies in which to avoid predation. The frog shown here uses camouflage to hide from both its predators and its prey. These are the poison arrow frogs of the Amazon rainforest. Their skin secretes a paralyzing poison that wards off predators. Indigenous hunters in the Amazon will also tip their arrows in this poison to aid them in their hunt. These frogs also exhibit something called warning coloration. Warning coloration is bright coloration used by organisms to ward off predators. It advertises that they are either unpalatable or poisonous. The viceroy butterfly shown on the right here uses a strategy called mimicry. Mimicry is imitating another species, and in this case, it's imitating the monarch butterfly. Birds and other predators know that the monarch butterfly doesn't taste good, and as a result, it'll avoid eating the viceroy butterfly as well. The moth and the caterpillar at the bottom of this diagram also exhibit mimicry. The spots on the moth's wings resemble the eyes of a much larger animal. When agitated, the caterpillar will change its shape to resemble a snake's head. The caterpillar also has a behavioral strategy because it'll wave its body around to mimic the movement of a snake. The relationship between predator and prey is a cat and mouse game in which one species is always trying to outsmart the other. Over time, this can lead to coevolution where one species changes in response to the other. A good example of this are bats and moths. Bats use echolocation to locate their prey. Moths, as a result, evolve more sensitive hearing so that they can hear these efforts to find them. This photograph shows another example of coevolution. The bird and the flower have evolved together so that the bird can depend on the flower for food and the flower can depend on the bird for pollination. Another example of symbiosis, or two species living and interacting with one another, is called parasitism. In parasitism, one organism, called the parasite, benefits, while another organism, called the host, is negatively affected. In parasitism, the parasite is usually smaller than the host. Also, the parasite rarely kills the host. If the host dies, the parasite no longer has an organism to benefit from. As a result, over time, these two species involved in a parasitic relationship can co-evolve. This diagram shows a parasitic fish called a lamprey feeding on the blood and tissue of another fish. This photograph shows a human parasite called the guinea worm being removed from the leg of this boy. Another example of symbiosis is mutualism, in which two species benefit from one another. It's important to know that in a mutualistic relationship, the species are not working together or helping each other. They're actually exploiting or using each other for some benefit. Nutrition and protection are common benefits of mutualistic relationships. For example, a clownfish receives protection from a sea anemone. The sea anemone receives nutrition in the form of fecal waste from the clownfish. Termites are another example. Termites have bacteria that live in their guts that help them digest wood. The termite receives nutrition, and the bacteria has a home. In this mutualistic relationship, The tick birds are feeding on the ticks on the body of this antelope. The tick birds receive nutrition. The antelope receives a free cleaning. Another example of a symbiotic relationship is commensalism, in which one species benefits and the other species experiences little to no effect. Epiphytes are one example of a commensal species. These are plants that grow on other plants. The plants that they grow on are not affected, but the epiphytes get access to sunlight. Another example are birds and their nest. When a bird builds a nest in a tree, the tree is not affected, but the bird has a place to lay its eggs and raise its young. Finally, sharks and remora are another example. Remora follow sharks along and feed on their food scraps, but the sharks are not affected. The pitcher plant on the left and the bromeliads on the right are examples of epiphytes, or plants that grow on other plants. Again, the plants they grow on are not affected, making this a commensal relationship. In section 5.2, we're going to look at how communities and ecosystems respond to changing environmental conditions. This section focuses on plants and a phenomenon called ecological succession. Over time, the plants that make up a community or ecosystem will change. When a community or ecosystem is first established, the plant species that appear there are called pioneer species. They are then replaced by intermediate species, which in turn are replaced by the climax community. There are two types of ecological succession. Primary succession occurs when there is no soil present. This can happen after a volcanic eruption or when rock is exposed. This diagram shows the progression of primary ecological succession. It begins with exposed rock and no soil, and over time, pioneer species come in, intermediate species come in, and finally, the climax community is established. The second type of ecological succession is called secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs after there's been some disturbance to the land, like a fire or human development. There is soil already present, and primary succession has already occurred once. This diagram shows the progression of secondary succession on a piece of abandoned farmland. It starts off with soil and some weeds that have begun to grow there. In reality, ecological succession does not occur in a predictable or uniform way. It's more like a mosaic with patches of vegetation in different stages of succession. When ecosystems experience disturbance, we can look at the response in different ways. We can look at the inertia of an ecosystem or its ability to survive moderate disturbances. We can also look at the resilience of an ecosystem. Resilience is the ability to bounce back or be restored after a moderate disturbance. We find that the greater the biodiversity, the greater the resilience an ecosystem has.